Lie on your back with your legs long, your feet apart. Start with a body scan. Notice the differences in your legs, right versus left, your arms, your shoulders. And watch your next few breaths, unmanipulated, and think to yourself about differences in sensation and volume. Does one side of you seem to breathe different than the other? What are the sensations that point to you to prove that to yourself? And put your hands on your lower abdomen, with elbows resting on the floor, hands loosely resting, shoulders restful. The thumbs might be at the height of your belly button or lower. Ride or surf the breath as it is. And give the lightest indication to breathe a little more there underneath your hands, to fill up with an invitation, not because you forced the air there and not at the expense of breathing anywhere else, but an invitation. Make the breathing down there a three-dimensional sense. Is it just filling up your hands? Or is it also filling up the space between your sacrum and lower back? As the air comes and goes, feel that swelling and unswelling. Can you feel the swelling sideways of the breath in the region of the waist? You might know that the lungs aren't down there, and what you're feeling is the intra-abdominal pressure that exists when the diaphragm moves down as you inhale. It presses your organs, all the soft parts of your abdomen, and pushes them out in all directions. Could you start to see, if you can perceive the breathing, pressing down towards the bottom of your pelvis, towards your hip joints, towards your sit bones, towards your pelvic floor? Could you just go on listening with the thought of a relaxed and softening pelvic floor? Is it possible to perceive any movement of the pelvic floor, just accompanying your breathing? Can you imagine that there could be a gentle easing or swelling down of the pelvic floor, a letting out of the sense of tonus, the sense of tone around the muscles of the genitals, somehow relaxing down as you inhale? When you exhale, it's not like they have to tighten. It's like maybe there's less pressure in the abdomen. Let that pressure make a sense of ease, of opening, especially on the inhale. You're looking for a minimal muscle tone in the pelvic floor. Not so little that you feel it's unsafe, like you'd have to run to the bathroom, but no more than you need to rest here comfortably. We'll see if that idea of feeling that minimal muscle tone in the pelvis gets easier as we explore. Now gently do what I'll call today as a non-Kegel, to very gradually and lightly draw up the pelvic floor, the feeling of pulling up of underneath, drawing up the perineum. For men, there could be a sense of drawing up the testicles a little bit. For women, a sense of drawing up inside the vagina. And also, you'll feel a little more effort in the anus and urethra. Just light, not strong or fast. Now let it out. You can listen to this as you create this little bit of additional tension in the pelvic floor, and then feel yourself let go of that. You're wondering, can you feel it under your hands, any activity in your belly muscles? They're quite closely connected to the pelvic floor tonus. And tonus just means the latent muscle tone or changing muscle tone. Would you go ahead and link the drawing up of the pelvic floor with an exhale? Could you breathe out and tighten a little bit underneath? And then when you inhale, can you let everything go? And if at the end of your inhale, you're still feeling holding of the pelvic floor, then just breathe in and breathe out again without squeezing the pelvic floor. How long does it take you to let go as much as you can? When you've gotten to that, at the next exhale, you can draw it up as much as you can. And then link something else. As you exhale, as you draw up the pelvic floor, would you ever so slightly tighten or shorten under your hands? Think of your pubic bone pulling up a little, your belly button pulling a little down or in, just to make yourself a little smaller. And inhale and relax your belly and your pelvic floor. Do that again. There's a little shift in the resting place of the pelvis, perhaps. See what you can do to relax unintended tensions elsewhere. Maybe in your eyes, your mouth, your neck. And then please bend your knees and stand your feet, put some space between them, and find a way that the lower legs can be quite vertical. So the feet are relatively close to your bottom, if that works for your knees. There's some nice space between your knees and your feet, and you feel your heels and feet are wide enough so that you don't have to do much work in the thighs. Then resume what we were doing. Breathe out, draw up the pelvic floor. Think of pulling your pubic bone a little bit upwards to slightly flatten your lower back. Then breathe in and let all that go. If you need another breath cycle to continue letting that go, then keep letting it go. Can you feel the sensation of the sacrum, that you rolled the resting weight of the sacrum towards your low back? And then let that go. You can also think of the tailbone. As you tighten the pelvic floor and your lower back flattens, that your tailbone might come a little more into the air. You can feel how that can be accompanied by the squeezing of everything, especially the squeezing of the anus as you're drawing up the pelvic floor. You might have a sense of tugging the tailbone in the air. You can associate those movements perhaps. See if you can continue doing this, relaxing between these non-Kegels, these gradual contractions. Notice, do your knees tend to get a little wider or a little narrower when you draw up the pelvic floor? If you had to guess, or you wanted to do a little experiment and fake it till you make it, do the knees want to get a little wider or narrower? It's very tiny. You might not perceive that shift yet. So let's try something else. Could you put your hands off yourself, rest with your knees bent and feet standing, and let go of the pelvic floor work? Sense your breathing as it is. We just find a gentle movement of gradually lifting the lower ribs, your lower chest, the upper part of your lower back. Just lift a tiny little bit. Breathing is easy and simple. Lift it up and put it back down gradually. The lower ribs, lower back arch a little bit, but of course your whole back, your whole spine arches into this gesture of extension. And you can let the pelvis move when you lift your lower back. What does the pelvis do? What does your neck do? Where can you shed unnecessary effort? And then let that go. And just press your lower ribs a little backwards. Flatten your back a little bit. Gently. Now let go of that. Go ahead and tie that into an exhale a few times. Just press the lower ribs, lower back as you breathe out. Feel the front of you shorten a little bit, just slightly when you breathe. And let your front enjoy this length. And breathe out. Your pelvis rolls up the mat as you flatten your lower back. A few times alternately, just press the lower back, lower ribs. Let go of that pressure. And lift slightly the lower back, lower ribs, and you'll find your pelvis can find permission to roll a little bit. And what a typical Feldenkrais student knows is 12 o'clock, 6 o'clock movement. Letting it roll a bit up the mat, down the mat. There's a sense of very simple flexion, of folding, pressing the lower ribs backwards, feeling your front half shorten, letting go of that folding and slightly extending that lower back, lifting the lower ribs, letting your whole back respond to that function, letting your pelvis roll down. And let that be. Lengthen your legs and take a rest. Feel, how do you breathe? Go ahead and bend your knees, stand your feet. Gently roll your pelvis up and down very easily. Notice, when do the knees get a little wider? When might the knees get a little narrower? Can you do an experiment? Find a one-to-one relationship of a slight broadening and narrowing of the space between the knees that somehow makes sense with the rolling of the pelvis. As your pelvis rolls up, can you draw up the pelvic floor slightly and let the knees come just slightly together? The lower back flattens, your lower ribs press. Exhale. Draw up the pelvic floor, knees together, then let go. As you inhale, let the knees draw a tiny bit apart and the pelvis rolls downward, and see if you can relax those pelvic floor muscles. Feel the pelvic floor tighten a little bit when the lower back flattens, the weight rolls up your sacrum, and the pelvic floor loosens a little bit when the lower back arches, the knees pull apart from one another. There's that feeling when the pelvis rolls down, those knees apart a little bit. The back has the lightest bit of arching, breathing, relaxing the sphincters, relaxing the pelvic floor as much as feels safe. Then gradually slightly tighten. And let that go. Let your legs long and take a rest. Now think of a place on your brow between your eyes, a center place in your imagination. To draw a line down over the length of your nose, over your upper lip, lower lip, chin. Feel yourself illustrate with a rich imagination a center line down the front of your body, down your sternum, between your breasts, down your abdomen, your belly button, down to the pubic bone, down to a place where there's a natural left and right division between the pelvic floor and the genitals around you, underneath to the back, the perineum, anus, between the buttocks, up the back of the sacrum, up your lower back, middle back, between your shoulder blades, back of your neck, back of your head, over the crown, and down over the forehead to its starting place. There you are in your imagination, precisely divided left and right. What is the difference that stands out most between the two sides? What do you think of these two sides right now without judgment? Just observing. One by one, bend your knees, stand your feet in that clear, simple, wide space so the skeletal architecture of the legs really leads to a poise in the middle where your muscles don't have to work in the legs. Would you gradually drift your knees to the left, both of them a little bit to the left? The standing feet on the ground, feel the weight roll to the left edge of the left foot, the inside edge of the right foot. Just drift your knees to the left. You can feel you have a rolling pelvis that it invited. You have hip joints that change through this movement. Very, very simple, just a couple of inches to the left. So it's completely reversible, so it's not a heaving sensation. You may even explore in your reversing that it's easier to bring the right knee back to standing before the left knee. You don't have to do it exactly at the same time. And let this little weight shift of the legs, of the pelvis, turn your spine, shift the weight of your chest even, your shoulders. Perhaps go ahead and purposely roll your head at some equal amount to the left as your knees go to the left. A simple turning of the body to the left. Never interfering with your breathing. Is there anything about this has an excess that causes you to hold your breath somewhere? Just reduce the movement or effort. Just have the knees drift a little bit to the left and sustain them to the left. You can feel this a little bit of muscular work that keeps them from just flopping all the way over there. If it feels like more work than you want to sustain, bring them closer to the middle and stay there and breathe. Very gently, you can feel how the ribs are on the ground. Make a little tiny movement in this position of pressing the lower ribs a little into the ground, letting the pelvis respond, and letting go of that pressure. And do that again. So the starting position is the knees and pelvis are turned a little left, and from there explore. Can you push your back into the ground a little bit? You can feel maybe a little shortening of your abdomen and let it go. And a couple of times, would you lift your left lower ribs a tiny bit or lighten them? They may not want to lift because your knees are over there. If it feels impossible, your knees are probably too far over there to the left. Remember your breathing. And bring your knees back to the middle, lengthening your legs. Just shed that. You can maybe feel when the pelvis was turned over there, when you lift and pressed your low back a little bit, how the weight shifted around on your pelvis. So bend your knees again, stand your feet, tilt your knees to the left a little bit again, keeping them there. Now bring them back. Could you draw the pelvic floor as if that was the initiator? The gradual drawing in of the pelvic floor brings your knees back to the middle. You get to the middle at the apex of the contraction that's comfortable for the pelvic floor, then stay in the middle and let that contraction go completely. It might take an extra cycle of the breath to really soften. Drift your knees to the left again, gradually bringing them home as you gradually draw up the pelvic floor. You get to the middle with the knees, the top of the pelvic floor contraction, then gradually let go of the pelvic floor contraction. Breathe, shed all the tension in the middle before you start over. When you're ready, you drift the knees over, and you're trying to create the sense that the drawing up of the pelvic floor and the accompanying efforts in the abdomen or hip joints, or groin, somehow the drawing up of the pelvic floor is the organizer for pulling the knees back up into standing. And when you get there, you just see if you can let your bones take your weight and let all the excess muscle tone just drift away. Let it go first. Then tip your knees to the left. And you draw up your pelvic floor to return them. Can you feel the path of the weight across your bottom? Associate that with the graduated drawing up of the pelvic floor. And then what happens to the weight of the pelvis when you let go of the pelvic floor, when you balance in the middle? What happens to the shape and ease of the belly, the back, the breath as you rest in the middle? And how do they change your belly and back as your knees drift left as you draw up from the pelvic floor to return home? Go ahead and lengthen your legs one by one and rest. When you feel refreshed, we'll have a chance to explore this on the other side. And it's neat to switch sides because you have some expectations, and yet the sensory raw data is unique. You have a genuine curiosity and learning about yourself. Bend your knees, stand your feet. A couple of times on your own, breathing comfortably. Not doing anything in particular with your pelvic floor, just drift your knees to the right and back home. The amount is completely reversible, lazy, and pleasant. The invitation is extremely inclusive here. The spine turns, your chest changes weight. Maybe you can find your shoulders and head can somehow be drawn to the right a little bit, following the weight of the knees. And we'll change the order on this side just for curiosity. You'll drift your knees to the right, leave them to the right. Draw up the pelvic floor in order to return your knees. Relax the pelvic floor in the middle completely. Then drift your knees to the right. Draw up the pelvic floor to gradually return home. Feeling the weight of the changes in your back and belly and letting everything go in the middle. As if you could just wash away all the muscle tone and be balanced. Be stood by your leg bones, everything quiet. And then drift into the right and see if you initiate by drawing up the pelvic floor, returning home. Now let's let go of the pelvic floor addition. Let's drift your knees to the right, keeping them there. See if you can find movements of pressing the right lower ribs into the ground, and then letting go. When you press your right lower ribs, what does that do to the weight of the pelvis, the position of your knees? And lift the right lower ribs and let that go a couple of times. It's interesting how the weight of the pelvis can roll down. It's already over to the right, but when you create a little tiny lifting of those lower ribs or lower back, the weight rolls down your pelvis a little bit. And let that go. Once again, drift your knees to the right. Just feel what elements are there when you draw up the pelvic floor to return. Can you sense the kind of changes around the abdomen, the back, the hip joints, the chest, maybe even the neck and head? Go through yourself and see if you can reduce any unnecessary efforts. Now rest, lengthen your legs. Bend one knee, your choice. You can leave the other leg long. Check that the one foot is clearly supporting its leg. You might sway the knee in the breeze just to see if you can really relax those adductor muscles of the thigh. And balance there as you now tilt the knee outwards. Would you let the weight of the knee tilting outwards as far as is reversible and comfortable? Not a big hip stretch. Just what you want to do. You can feel that the pelvis rolls to follow the knee, but give that permission, even with that long, heavy leg there on the other side of your body. How can you relax and feel broad across the front of the pelvis? Broad, rolling across the back of your pelvis, that long other leg. Maybe it rolls a little bit from the heel and the calf. Just a little bit. And then tip it out, and could you see if you can assemble a way to draw in by drawing up the pelvic floor so that you tip it out and relax and breathe, and then think of pulling in the pelvic floor, drawing yourself up from underneath as an initiator and organizer for standing up the knee, and then, very important, you stay there long enough to shed all the effort. Then begin again. Drift the knee outward. Feel the roll of the pelvis, the shape of the back changing. Draw up the pelvic floor as an organizer to pull the knee up to standing and let go of the pelvic floor. Put your attention into that last step especially, letting go. And tip that knee outwards as far as is pleasant for you, and straighten the leg down. Now feel the two sides, both legs long. Can you cultivate an image of breathing into that hip joint, breathing into that side of the pelvic floor? Now switch knees, bend the other knee, stand the other foot. And try this over there. Drift it outward, a pleasant, reversible amount. And check that your foot position is giving that simple skeletal poise in the middle. As soon as you're familiar with that movement, go ahead and layer in drawing up the pelvic floor to help you restand the leg, and then enjoy the standing bones of your lower leg, your relaxed resting pelvis, and let out all the tension of the pelvic floor, really taking time between the movements. It's in the letting go, in the variability that will give you more control, more adaptability of the pelvic floor for all of life's activities. And when you're ready, you can let this go. Slip that leg long, and breathe. And bend both knees, stand both feet. Butterfly the knees a little toward and away from each other, just a little bit. Totally effortless. There's no momentum to it. Just poise, drifting outside then inside. And what do you feel in your back, in your belly? When would it be somewhat conducive to slightly press the lower ribs, Which direction of the knees? And then slightly lift the lower ribs. Could you layer in slightly tightening the pelvic floor? Consciously letting it free and loose as you can, relaxing the sphincters as much as safe. Could you still smoothly move with your knees? Can you become a little more smooth with the pelvic floor? Go ahead, let the legs long and rest. Just feel how you give all this up, how you meet the floor now, how you breathe. Put your hands on your lower abdomen and ever so slightly invite a little extra volume of breath there, three-dimensionally, in that region where your hands are. Breathe as if you feel your hip joints softening and expanding, your sacrum being pressed by the volume from the inside, and your pelvic floor expanding and dropping down a little bit as you inhale, and staying expansive and at ease as you exhale. Feel that quality of breathing. Keep listening with your hands. And ever so slightly, you just create a tiny little bit of additional pelvic floor tension. Sustain that tension and go on breathing. Just feel how the effect of that little bit of effort throughout your system, throughout yourself, might be some somatic changes, breathing changes. You might notice a change in the headspace. And then let that little bit of pelvic floor tension go. It's really good to be aware of those differences. Sensing the effects of our unnecessary efforts is incredibly important to actually learning to have control over them. And if we can create more variety of pelvic floor tonus in regular life, we'll learn to have more and more detail, and we can have more and more control in the moments we really need it. Bend your knees and stand your feet. You can roll to your side. Gradually come to a sit and then to stand. Now just feel how your bones stand you. If you don't technique anything, just be stood. How do you breathe? What kind of posture emerges out of that? What's the shape of your back and your front? And ever so slightly, would you draw up the pelvic floor? When you do this movement in standing, it directly opposes gravity. That means that gravity is your ally in letting down the pelvic floor more. See if you can feel the weight of it. Like the sling, the hammock of the pelvic floor tissue just softens, goes downwards. Draw it up gradually. Let it down gradually. Stay relaxed. Begin to walk a little around your room. And feel, how do you move? How do you balance? How do you turn? Then just ever so slightly as you walk, could you draw up the pelvic floor and feel the changes it makes on how you move and sense yourself? And let that go. You can play with that any time. No one has to know if you're exploring your pelvic floor tonus. But please dodge the culture messaging that everything is about strength. Rather, would you play with ever so slight efforts of contractions and a bit of application of attention. Very slight muscular efforts, really big curiosity to look at what they change in you as you move through the world. Thank you.